what the hell does anything have this had to do with this title? And hopefully it'll all come together as we get close to the end. But first, a little bit about my background. I was born in South Weymouth, Mass. My family history in hurricanes is unbelievable. Most of my father's family was impacted by the 1938 hurricane. He was at the University of New Hampshire and watched the big elm tree come through his fraternity house. His aunt, my great aunt, was the secretary for the superintendent of Providence Schools, and their building was right on the town square where the famous pictures of the storm surge coming in. And she could tell me at the age of 91 everything she did that day. Because of course she had no TV, no radio. She never married. She was a fine Christian woman. She didn't even read newspapers. She had no idea what was happening when that happened, but she could remember it until the day she died. It was a benchmark event for the folks in New England in that generation. Dad was an engineer, chemical engineer, went to work for DuPont down in Delaware, which is where I was raised, in this general part of the world. Hurricane Hazel, when it came in 54, decided to blow a piece of 2x4 through a window in our house in Wilmington, Delaware. I remember that. And he remembered the fact that I thought that was cool. At that point, he thought it was something wrong with his kid. 1962, Ash Wednesday storm. I'll bet you a lot of you folks know about that or read about it. It caused a bunch of damage. It was a stall, a big winter storm. It didn't move much, which is the unusual part of it. There was a class action lawsuit in federal court, get this, over whether wind or water was the cause of the damage. Think we've come any farther today? That's part of why people don't get it, by the way. And the way things work in your life, my father ended up on the jury for that. I'm 14 back then. Typical 14-year-old. I just wanted to screw up. I didn't give a rat's behind about school. Dad would come home. The case was in the summer. Cases went faster back then. And he talked to me about, each side had meteorologists that had these hand-drawn, beautiful charts trying to explain their side of the case. My career was launched. You mean you can get paid for drawing colored lines on paper? Hey, heaven is sports. So I actually knuckled down, graduated median in my class with a C+ average, and the only university that would take me without going to summer school was Texas A&M. Coming from the Northeast, I'd never been west of Cumberland, Maryland, or south of the Outer Banks. Does that look like a university to you from folks on the East Coast? Looks like a friggin' prison, doesn't it? One of my letters home in the freshman year, I said, "Dear Mom and Dad, I really like it here, but guess what? I've discovered the last bastion of the Confederacy." That's funny. Think about it. The guys in the Northeast now. No women. It's an all-male school. No cable TV. And we're far enough away from Houston, that means there was one station in Bryan, and it went off the air at about 8 in the evening anyway. TV in the dorm. What did it matter? It was a dry county. So my perfectly good fake Delaware driver's license that said I was 21 was useless. I couldn't even buy beer. So guess what? I learned how to study. There was no distractions. And that's A&M of then. And oh, by the way, Hurricane Beulah made landfall in Texas in 1967. I was really kind of interested in basic synoptic meteorology, but Hurricane Beulah kind of twisted me. Went down and did a tour of South Padre Island. How many of you are familiar with South Padre Island? It's all developed now. It's like South Florida, wall-to-wall high-rises and hotels and stuff. The only thing you could tell that a human had ever been on South Padre Island was a twisted telephone pole that hadn't been washed away. It's going to happen again, folks. A&M today is 45,000 strong. There are more women than men. The meteorology program is about 60-40, females to males. Big difference. But the golf course is still a forlorn mass of nothing.
One big sand trap.
And now,
wow.
I kind of like that. I refer to my drives as Scud missile launching. I can go far, but I have no idea where we're going to land. Doesn't matter on that golf course. You go find it and whack it again and hope there's a mistake nearby. They had a little thing called the draft fair. The only lottery I've ever won in my life was the draft lottery. And it got me a 4-year all-expense paid tour with the United States Navy. Back then, even though my father was a chemical engineer and all that good stuff, and he made decent money, people didn't travel on airliners for vacation. You couldn't afford that if you were middle class. You went by car. I had been on 4 flights in my entire life when I showed up in Jacksonville, Florida, to fly on these planes in the hurricanes. My major contribution to the United States Navy was not hurricane reconnaissance. It was helping the chaplain get religion to the crew members. Because the meteorologists actually controlled the flight, just like they do today. Once you enter the flight pattern, the domain of the reconnaissance mission, they turn control over to the director, the flight director, which is what they call them now. We're meteorologists, flight meteorologists then. 23 years old, 4 flights, 500 feet above the deck, 100 knots of wind. Would you trust the judgment of a 23-year-old recent graduate of college to push your airplane at 500 feet? I guarantee you, when they came back, they had religion. That P-3 doesn't look much different than the ones we use today. Luck would have it, I flew Agnes.
Oh, wow. Holy cow.
Can you imagine that? And my flight, my 2 flights, I had 2 flights. The first flight was what we call a beach patrol down here along, when it was coming inland. Down there, they call you off the pattern, you don't fly them over land, so you get down there and you fly back and forth on the beach reporting what the damage is looking like and what the wind field looks like on the shore. Then 2 days later, I flew the flight that renamed it as it came back offshore. And we were originally doing beach patrol along here, waiting for it to come offshore. Then all of a sudden, the wind started howling out of the north, and we flew a couple of fixes on it off of Jersey before we had to come back down here to Norfolk and then fly it again. It was too late. It was already inland then. That is the sickest I've ever been. It was the first operational P-3 flight. We had flown test flights to prove that the wings wouldn't fall off, but it was the first time we flew it on a scheduled mission in support of the Hurricane Center. That's when I found out I have vertigo. That's when I also, shortly thereafter, I found out, hey, guess what? You cannot become a pilot. We don't want you in the cockpit with vertigo. Now I have, my mother's family are all mostly rural people in this part of the country, southeast Pennsylvania. And a lot of them experienced flooding from that. None of them got in their houses, but their properties got flooded, some of their outbuildings and things like that. And floods have been the theme of my hurricane career all along. It's just eerie, it's weird. Some say that's normal for you. How many of those lines would you guess have been added since that flight in the Hurricane Agnes? 500? How many think about 500?
Since 72?
Yep.
412.
1,000.
What?
Over 1,000.
That's what I meant.
There's both Pacific and Atlantic, and there's actually more. We know now that it's a more active basin than the Atlantic is the Eastern Pacific. The Western Pacific's the most active typhoon territory, and then the East Pac is the next. And before we had satellites, the tropical meteorology course I took in 1968 stated unequivocally, Herbert Real has documented 3 to 4 hurricanes a year are expected in the Eastern Pacific. We had no satellites and cross shipping lanes. How do you know they existed? So there you go, 1,000. So you hear people, we even talk, it's a rare event. For any one spot on the earth, getting nailed by a big tropical cyclone is a fairly rare event. But in the grand scheme of things, these aren't rare. They're normal occurrences. 25 to 30 a year occur in my area of responsibility. I was all pumped up on my resume when I put in for this job 4 years ago. I personally worked about 30 storms. Since then, I've worked 110. Nothing to it, man. Then I went to Kingsville, Texas. That's where I learned about hurricane planning. As the station, the officer in charge of the weather station there, I was also in charge of pulling together the hurricane plan for Navy Kingsville. And it was an eloquent plan. It was actually, mostly updating what they already had. But that's how I learned the importance of planning. And the fact that then I learned afterwards that most people just flat don't do it. The Navy got it and they did it because most of their assets were exposed to hurricanes. So it was they learned by error, I'm sure, to do that. But I want you to notice something. What else do you notice about this? Is my motley crew down there. 2 civilians, me, a chief petty officer, and the various Robert First Mates that supported the operation. What do you notice different from sailors then and sailors today.
People wore really bad clothing back then.
Frank Morgan almost died flying in a hurricane. He was the onboard meteorologist in Hurricane Cleo in 1964 that almost took a Super Connie to the ocean.
Oh, man.
They landed it back in Rosie Roads, Puerto Rico, and then they took it apart. It would never fly again. They don't know how they got it back. Well, the meteorologist sat in the tail section of all things of the Connie. And when they hit the shear eddy and the eye wall, he went up first, and then when he slammed down, it broke both elbows.
Oh,
and when he went back up, it broke one knee.
Oh.
And he had a couple of cracked ribs and a collapsed lung.
Wow.
And that guy was crazier than I am. He wanted to go back and fly again. So he was a civilian for us.
Are you in there?
Hmm?
Are you in there?
Yes.
Look for right, yeah.
For the young ladies in the group, when you think there's a hot-looking young man out there, just think of me right now. 40 years later, we're all kind of chunky and ugly. It just happens, folks. I know where about half of these are. One of my proudest moments is this guy wrote me recently and said that I'm the influence that caused him to successfully fight alcoholism. I'm serious. I take more pride in that. I mean, I've really gotten more than a whole lot of this other crapola we consider success in life. You can turn someone's life around, it's worth its weight in gold. But now, if I took the same picture now and ate in Kingsville, they're all heavier. We're skinny in that picture. This guy was, he had to lose weight in order to be qualified to be E9. He was brilliant, but he was considered heavy. Does that guy look heavy to you in today's standards? Hell no. We've changed. I went back to graduate school, got my master's degree, and then after a brief period of unemployment, the Weather Bureau saw fit to hire me, and I went to San Antonio, where I immediately worked a bunch of big floods. Amelia, how many of you even remember Amelia? Bingo.
There's about 4 of us in here.
Yeah. It doesn't get talked about much now, but it was a horrendous inland flood event from an otherwise meaningless tropical storm that was just barely tropical storm strength at landfall in South Texas. But I guarantee you, when you put 46 inches of rain in 2 days over Texas Hill Country, you have floods of record. The Guadalupe River, which you can walk across, well, today you can walk across the rocks because they're in a drought, but on a normal summer day, you can walk across without getting your knees wet. At Kirkville, Texas, the flow at the peak of the flood from this was faster and more quantity than crossing in front of the arches on the Mississippi in St. Louis. Claudette played a role in my future job market. It flooded Alton, Texas, in 43 inches of rain, 24 hours. The weather office was in Alton, south of Houston. The MIC's family, his house was in a place called Friendswood, Texas, and his wife had to be rescued from the roof of their house. And she pointedly said to him, next year when you're eligible to retire, either you and I are moving to Tennessee, or I and your money are moving to Tennessee. That set in motion a chain of events that eventually led to me working in Houston.
Very nice.
My brief stint at inland weather, most of my academic studies were in convective weather, radar meteorology, and severe weather. And so I thought I ought to work somewhere where that's traditionally done. So I went to Fort Worth. I worked there 6 years. The only tropical events we had were Alicia and Gilbert, the inland effects. Gilbert was huge. We actually had a tornado in Plano, Texas. And if you recall, Gilbert went inland near Monterrey, Mexico, for God's sake. And the influence went that far astray from the
What's 1 to 5?
Hmm?
Before it hit the U.S.?
Yes, Gilbert
It was
was
a 5 across the Caribbean.
Yeah.
It was probably a 3 when it made
Right.
landfall in Mexico. The Yucatan spread it out enough that it couldn't get its circulation. And then I really lost my mind when I came up here and worked in our headquarters in Silver Spring, Maryland. I used to refer to this as the 1 millionth architectural wonder of the Soviet Union. I am told it is now a condominium. I can't imagine.
That's pretty pathetic.
The office art place, the guy before me enjoyed cigars. So I came in there, and the old wooden chair on it, one of the wheels was missing off the chair, so it sat like that. And back then you had stuff you put in drawers, so I pulled the drawer open, and there was about 15 cigars in various stages of having been smoked. You couldn't smoke in the building, and what his secretary said, he'd open the window, and he'd take a couple hits on his cigar and stub it out on the bricks. That's where I learned how politics and hurricanes work. I worked the night shift for the support office to brief staff and congressmen. Well, I got to talk to Senator Hollings on a first name basis by the end of that night when Hugo came in. I learned the importance of getting your elected officials educated on what this all means while working there. Well, I loved it so much that after 2 years, 10 months and 3 days, plus or minus a couple hours,
But who's got it?
I didn't like headquarters work. It needs to be done, but it's not me. My dream job was not what I'm doing now. My dream job was to be an MIC of the forecast office. I wanted to be that from the time I was in San Antonio, and I got my wishes when we did the modernization, and Houston Galveston came up, and practically nobody wanted it. It's got a lot of challenges there, and hurricanes are just one of them. But these are the storms that, we worked a lot more of them, but these are the ones that made a dent in history down there. Andrew, because of its proximity, you can actually watch it. We had the only Gulf Coast 88D at the point, the fifth one that was installed. And you could actually track it as it went into Vermilion Bay. And I had the county judge for Galveston County who didn't think we could close his office down in Galveston because he didn't trust what we were doing with the radar. Well, I sat him down at our, what we called the pup back then, to look at the stuff there. Turned around and I said, well, you son of a bitch, I guess we can't close that office. So we did. Allison and Rita were really the killer events. So Francis, that people forget, is a forerunner to what happened in these, where I say people just don't learn. The Bolivar Peninsula, that we all saw pictures of after Ike, had 9 feet of water came across Bolivar, a tropical storm Francis. The tallest piece of sand on the Bolivar Peninsula is 6 feet. So for people to say they had no idea what would happen when a hurricane came to Bolivar, it either is sheer lunacy or denial. It's got to be one or the other. And Allison, of course, has got the record rain, and Rita the unbelievable flood. What got me to NHC was Max Mayfield and I share similar philosophies on how you should do this job. And he'd bring me over to work hurricane events. We bring people in when there's a landfall because the briefing workload gets more than I've got staff to handle. And we have a female liaison office embedded within there, and that's how we do this thing. And these were the 3. He brought me over to Isabel because people from Oklahoma can't pronounce Rappahannock. And many other Indian names for the river systems up and down the East Coast. So I could, therefore that's what I did. I worked these 2, Katrina being obviously the historical one that no one will ever forget, hopefully. So now I'm at the Hurricane Center herding cats. There's 50 people in the building. 45 of us are government, and we have 5 contractors. They're all genius scientists except me. I'm the manager with the C- or C+ high school education, proving that theory. This building was designed by Herb Safford. Does that name ring a bell?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I think you'd like to ride out a hurricane in a Herb Safford designed building. I don't really have qualms about it, though. Even he acknowledged that he wouldn't trust this over a Cat 3 wind. Flat roof with a lot of junk on it starts doing one of these. It oscillates. And even in Katrina with about 85-mile-an-hour winds, you could hear the thump going on the roof. And there's a lot more dishes up there now. So we may end up with a lot of water leaks. We don't know. We've got plans on that to mitigate it. I don't feel the least bit concerned about riding out a hurricane. And I rent. Owning, you worry about landfall. Renting, you worry about the inconvenience, and that's about it. Here's our area of responsibility. Kind of huge. The hurricane responsibility is the dark red. Not much ever happens up in here, but every now and then something's going to sneak in the San Diego to LA area. Since it's rare enough, they're probably not really prepared for it. We do marine forecasts. That's where and many people are not familiar with that, but we have a huge area where we do the marine forecast for the tropics, and we're backups for the extratropics on the adjacent boundaries for that area. And it's a staff of 17, works 24/7, 365 that keep that going. And it's not the sexy stuff that gets in the news. But there isn't a day go by that you're not hearing from shippers about the importance of that marine forecast across the tropical oceans. How many are familiar with the World Meteorological Organization? It's a cool group. It's actually a part of the UN and it kind of works. I mean, really. We don't even get along well with ourselves in our own country. Just watch the crap that goes on that passes for negotiations on a budget here right now. Not just at the federal level, right down to your state, your local, all your communities there. We don't get along well together, folks. But we actually do a pretty good job in meteorology. We are the regional specialized meteorological center for Region 4, which covers these countries, including Canada and the UK through Bermuda, with the tropical cyclone forecast responsibility. We do the forecast, that's the agreement. We put out the forecast information, but each individual nation maintains their jurisdiction for issuing watches and warnings. You would think, God, this must be a nightmare. It works. We pull it off. And have been since I first got involved in it. I'll let this movie play here while I talk a little bit. We put out a forecast, and right now we call the individual countries that are in the path for their decision on watches and warnings. We're actually testing this year a chat room on NWS Chat to work this through on a more modern basis, and plus have a documented translator to make sure we get the right answers. We have language barriers here. We've got Dutch, French, English, Spanish, and Papiamento. How many of you can speak Papiamento? You know where Papiamento is spoken? Netherlands Antilles, Curaçao, Aruba, and Bonaire. And it's kind of a mix of all the languages I mentioned before, plus a native language there. The stupa cabrito, you know what that would be? It's goat stew. Cabrito, it's kind of like, it's actually pretty good. You got stuff called tutu. Now that looks like a brick of you know what, but it actually tastes pretty good. I didn't ask what went in it. It tasted pretty good. And the liqueur Curaçao comes from there. Anyway, if you watch that, you see there's a nice progression of watches and warnings there. It actually works. We actually have been doing the hurricane warnings for Haiti. It's really a failed country. And there'll be time, you almost never get through on the phone, but because of the earthquake and what we've done in our region, I think we have a warning system for Haiti now, and they will become much like the other countries down there. We do a hurricane awareness tour on the east and Gulf Coast with a P3, and we also do the Caribbean. When I was in the Navy, it was a 2-week trip, and you stopped at about 14 places. And it was just to talk to officials. Now it's mainly geared towards educating school kids. We get thousands come out. To them, it's a big deal. I mean, they'll have a band out there welcoming you, all kinds of neat stuff goes on. Last year, over 30,000 people came through the C-130 on the stops we made. How many of you have heard of Tuxtla Gutierrez? Me either. 2 million people. Capital of Chiapas State. And they get flooding like crazy from the heavy rains down there. Just some pictures of the stuff we do. It's the C-130s that we take out there. And you can get a lot of people through there. You drop the flap on the tail, you run them up through the back end of the thing there, talk about the weather mission, and shove them out the front door where you get pictures taken with the young Air Force people. And the little kids still like the old man. I can get pictures taken with that, but not the young ladies usually. I love kids. I mean, they're photographic. They love to do it. You can't take pictures of kids in the U.S. now.
Really?
The laws. You've got to stay away from that. The media are supposed to stay away from it. It's just how it works. But that's the gist of what we do as we go around the Caribbean. And every now and then I get a handle on it. So they get a handle on me. Or I get a handle on things. Or does it get a handle on me? These were beauty winners in Chiapas State. As soon as I came off the plane, wham. First thing was a Gmail back to Donna. This is what happened. And on Facebook is, wow, this is what happened. Man. This is a 12-foot Burmese python, 75 pounds weight. It had recently been confiscated from a drug lord in San Juan, and the animal control just dropped it on my shoulders. Thank God I had a boa constrictor once, and I kind of understood the drill. You put a cap over its snout, muzzle it, and it won't. In theory, it won't strangulate you because it can't grab you. And sure enough, it seemed content enough just to weigh me down. Cool stuff. This is these are the you like names with faces that you see the names on our forecast. Stacy talked with you last year. I would have been up here, but I had a ruptured eardrum and couldn't fly. I think Todd spoke when you guys were up in Providence. Yeah. And as long as you're holding it in July, I can try to send somebody every year. But once you get into August, we don't even try to plan troops. I need them all on board. It is tough to get people back in a hurry if you have to. It disrupts a lot of things, including your conference when that happens. So, I started my career, my brief 40 years of chasing these canes, we were averaging 125-mile error per day back in the early 1970s, and now it's 50. And there's a lot of factors that go into it. Better models, better understanding what's going on, but the heavy machinery to run high-resolution models has been the real key to improving the forecast out beyond 24 hours. And continues to be so. And we actually can show that. This is skill trends for the models. And you'll see some area, we have a step function increase. There's another one back here that's not on this graph. And you can almost always find what was done in the models or in computing power that allowed us to do a better job of forecasting the steering currents that make hurricanes move. The question is, are we entering a leveling off period now? Because we really haven't, nothing really new has been put in relative to hurricane model forecasting in the last 3 or 4 years. And to my knowledge, nothing big on the horizon to improve the resolution much beyond what we are now on the long range part. I show people that, they mostly go to sleep, but when I show them this, they understand what I'm talking about. This is Isabel, the actual forecast cone in 2003, only 8 years ago. The reason we went to 5 days was a demand by the U.S. Navy that they need that for decision making and sorting the fleet. And lo and behold, the very first storm that we used this on, the decision was made correctly to sorting the fleet. So now the Navy likes us. We even have a liaison officer embedded within the staff at the Hurricane Center. And guess what? They now want it out to 7 days. As do people that bet on the weather. We went to this when we could prove we could do it with skill that was on a linear path with what we do now. The same thing will happen on day 6 and 7, and I wouldn't be surprised if 2 to 5 years from now we have a 7-day forecast. Now, what I want to do different is how we portray that, because one of the things that's happened is people think the forecast is as skillful at day 5 and we can take these out of here, and you know what? So they won't follow the skinny black line. The stupid SOBs drop the damn thing in there anyway. We have some great studies going on that we can now hang our hat on. We're going to probably change how we portray uncertainty on the track forecast in the near future. We actually have I'm co-chairing a group with social scientists to work with us on coming up with there is no perfect answer, because what works for one set of our constituents doesn't work well with another. And there's just no way you can come up with a perfect forecast for this. One of the scientists did in the study was they took, I think it was AccuWeather's cone, the Weather Channel's cone, I forgot what the third one was, and our cone, and all they did was ask the people who come to do the survey, tell us what you think this means. And the answer that we would have liked, any one of the 4 of us who were being surveyed on that, was not the #1 answer that people gave, which is it represents the most likely path at the center of the hurricane. That's all it is. On ours, you see we go from the 3-day where it's solid white to a white hashed. The #1 answer, oh, it's turning into a rainstorm. The Weather Channels was the other one I really remember. In the Steve Lyons era, he had it going from reds to purples and fuzzier shades of colors to indicate, in his mind, and ours too, we thought, that's great, it makes it sound like it's less certain. Oh, it's getting weaker was the #1 answer. And that was the case with most of them. It's getting weaker was the #1 answer. A few people thought it was getting bigger, which it's not harmful though. You're not going to make a bad decision as far as ignoring it if you think it's getting bigger and badder that far out of time. So, if you're an emergency manager and you're talking most likely, in 2003 we excite people from north coast of Florida to Jersey on this particular forecast. In 2011 we excite them from south of Myrtle up to Cape Henry. Maybe Jersey too, because most people connect the dots further as it goes on, but it's beyond 5 days. So the value in getting better at the track is self-evident in that, and it paid off in Earl. I think, and it may have actually caused some problems. Let me pop these up here. Last year we had a whole bunch form right off of Africa. Any of you have a reason why we had them develop right away off of Africa last year? The ocean was the warmest we've ever seen. It was 4 degrees above normal. Normally the water off of Africa, because of the west coast upwelling and all, doesn't really have the heat content to support tropical cyclones. So you see, it looks like a good load come off of Africa, and all of a sudden you have a mid-level vortex center, and then you have to follow it until it finds some moisture somewhere further east to ignite again. Well, last year they were igniting right off the coast because it was warm. And Earl was the classic winner of that, and it came steadily across the Atlantic and really didn't get doing much until it got just east of the islands. It went through a rapid intensification east of the islands. And how many of you, has any of you heard anyone say we did a lousy job with Earl?
Did a great job. Yeah, super.
Hey, if you lived in St. Martin's, you wouldn't think we did that great a job. Didn't forecast the RI, we rarely do. We're forecasting it to steadily intensify. But here's the real reason why. When it was out in the pond, we didn't give rats behind. Because the forecast was showing it to recurve. In fact, we said, oh good, it's going to recurve and screw with Bermuda, but leave us alone. We were having trouble with, here's 24, 36, and 48 hours. Those are perfect forecasts. I mean, it's noise level. The light line represents the actual path that Earl took. And for this particular advisory, these were the best models that we used and what their forecast positions were. And they were spot on. They were not off 60 miles in 48 hours. Good forecast. 72, 96, and 48, it started deviating, recurving too fast. One of the things that I think happens, two things. No one wants to study subtropical highs. How many of you know of a recent breakthrough science on modeling the strength and position of the great subtropical high in the Atlantic Ocean? It's like asking a proctologist to do research on hemorrhoids. No one will pay you for it. But we think that's one of the things that breaks down. If there's a bias in the transatlantic portion of the hurricane forecast track, it turns it too soon to the north. The other thing was the models were also intensifying it faster than it did, and the steering mechanism, the stronger the storm, the deeper the steering mechanism you look at for steering it. So when they're weak, tropical storms are somewhat sheared. They're being steered better by the lower component than the upper. When they're fully developed with a big deep eye, they're steered by the whole deep atmosphere. So we're doing some some neat research going on the diagnostic of that, but no one's doing the subtropical high research. So for the islands, this was a bad forecast in their minds. They thought they were off the hook. But if you actually look at it, in skill, it was within skill. This cone represents the 2/3 likelihood of where the center will be on a 5-year running mean error. That's not a great forecast, but it's within the skill, and it's going to be 1/3 of the time worse over time. So there were some that weren't that, and I heard about it at our annual meeting at the Region 4. But it was in Grand Cayman, so who was going to complain? All right. Once the storm was in the Northeast Caribbean, and it was starting its, we had the break in the high, and we were starting its northward tug into the westerlies, the whole system on forecasting changed to this. These are all the official forecasts in blue, and the white is the actual track it took. That's why everyone said what a great job the forecast was. I mean, the only bias we had on east or west was off of Cape Cod, and that was like 30 to 60 miles at the most on any given forecast there. Again, at 48 hours, that's almost noise. So this was an exceptionally good handle by the models, and of course the forecasters accepting the models in a track forecast on the East Coast, and because of that, relatively few evacuations. Now, the confidence amazed me. I could not convince the folks in New England that they were making a decision outside our skill not to evacuate Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard. Next time we have a storm that follows a similar scenario, my problem will be if trying to convince them that it's not the right decision to hold your water up there. And if they get whacked in the big one there, guess who's going to get yelled at? We keep working on that track part. Now here's one. In 2008, Because of this, the length of the Texas coast, to move the assets, there are not enough planes, trains, automobiles, and buses to evacuate everyone along the Louisiana and Texas coast in advance of a hurricane. It does not exist. So decisions have to be made on where to put those assets. For Texas, it has to be made in 96 hours, whether to have the deployment over here for Beaumont and Houston or down here for Lower Rio Grande Valley. Think that's a tough decision?
Yeah.
That's a long coastline. Well, and the assets are pre-positioned. They'll pre-position them in Austin and San Antonio and then fan them out to the areas that need them. And this is actually a very good forecast skill-wise. The storm went here, the white line. The official forecast was down here over the central Texas coast. The decision was made actually to go halfway. They came down to about 100 miles from the coast with the assets, and then the next day jumped them over to southeast Texas when we were confident the Lower Rio Grande Valley did not need to be evacuated. So from a science point of view, we knew this was a skillful forecast. From a public point of view, they didn't think it was good. The expectations of your public is much higher than our own knowledge of what our skill is at hurricane forecasting. Here's why it's a problem. Now I'm starting to get into some of the why people don't get it. We let them live here. I lived in it too. I lived right here when I first went down there. That's a zone A. You have to get the hell out of Dodge for almost every storm. There was less than 500,000 people in that evacuation zone in 1992. There's 1 million folks there now, and guess what? Other than the minor hiccup from the space shuttle program going down, there's no hint that the growth of the evacuation zones will stop there. We don't build in the 100-year floodplain. We build in the 110, baby. Ike. 48 hours is the must-decide major evacuation for the Houston-Galveston area. At the 48-hour forecast, which is here, Ike would have come, if it verified, he would have come across the west end of Galveston Island and augured in right over Houston. And oh, by the way, we had 15 knots stronger than what actually occurred at landfall. We measure plus or minus 5 to 10 knots, and our average error is plus or minus 15. So that deviation is within the noise of the skill of forecasting the absolute intensity of a hurricane. Never mind the shape of the wind field and how it evolves over land. That's a short-term mesoscale phenomenon. You're not going to forecast that at 48 hours when the decision's made. All of this, of the 250 petrochem plants that represent 45% of this nation's petrochem output, 80% of them were flooded. So we thought it. Oh, by the way, another 15% is here, and the rest are in Louisiana. Johnson Space Center would have been under 8. The shallowest point would have had 8 feet of water over the pavement at Johnson Space Center. And there was a mission up, by the way. My old house would have been toast. My weather office would have been toast. My new house is here. I call it Mount Galveston, 30 feet above sea level. I have flood insurance. More on that later. So that was a scenario we were facing, and there was actually one city that chose not to evacuate, Texas City. And they think they did the right thing. They have a dike around it. The water got this far from the top. Next time, they will not evacuate, and if it goes west, they'll have dead people. Because their houses are flat on the ground and nowhere to put them. And, of course, they have petrochem plants that make the big nasties. Petrochem plants kind of get it. It's just weird. Well, here's where Ike actually went. 300,000 less people. And you're going to bet on decision-making on a 20-mile deviation in 48 hours. It's a horrible challenge to get decision-makers to do the right thing who've been trained. Think about your general population who have not been. We're flatlining on intensity forecast, the average forecasted intensity. Again, though, we only measure, if it's satellite, it's plus or minus 10 to 15 knots. If it's with recon, it's 5 to 10 knots. We never sure we've sampled the maximum wind. That's what we're verifying off here is the maximum intensity somewhere within that rotating eye. So plus or minus 10 or 15 knots to me is about what you're going to get no matter how good we get. That's not the important part of the problem. Any decision maker I know can live with plus or minus 15 knots. That's not a problem. It's not going to affect his decision that tight. This is what will. This is a real storm. It was Hurricane Felix, and it went through a rapid intensification over the eastern Caribbean with no threat to land. But we were flying it, so we have great data on it. But picture, if you will, that this storm is in the Bay of Campeche. And New Orleans, Lake Charles, Beaumont, Houston, Galveston all require 48 hours lead time for a Cat 3 or higher evacuation. And that's from in theory, it's from the onset of tropical storm force winds, not the passage of the center. So, instead of being in the Caribbean, it's now in the Bay of Campeche. You've got a 35-knot tropical storm. These are our best intensity models. At 48 hours, they forecast 60 knots max. Most of them are 40 knots or less. Let's say we bite off on the 60 knotter. We ask them to add a category. How many of you think they'll pull an evacuation anywhere on the Gulf Coast for this storm? Right? Correct answer. 12 hours goes by. It's now a 50-knot tropical storm, and we're now going to forecast it to a 75-knot hurricane, but not 48 hours, 36 hours away. How many think they'll pull an evacuation? Correct answer. I know this because I drill them. I run these exercises. I've been doing it for 20 years. They will not pull the plug. Okay, 24 hours. Now we have a hurricane with 65 knots. Looked like it was leveling off. It only went up 5 knots in the last 6 hours. All our guidance showed a steady intensification to about 90 knots and then leveling off. So now we forecast 90 knots, but that's 24 hours later, and it's already rain bands coming on the coast of Louisiana. Think they'll call for an evacuation? They need to, but they won't. And then it goes absolutely apeshit overnight. It hits lands 145 knot, Category 4 hurricane.
Is that a hurricane term that you guys use?
Only after I retire, I think. But guess what? I bet you the public would understand that.
They would.
I probably don't need a social science study to do that. That is what keeps me awake at night, are those in the Gulf. And everyone thinks these are rare. They don't happen very often. Umberto was close. Its entire life cycle was captured in the span of the radar range of the Houston Galveston radar. It formed on the first advisory. It was located there, south of Galveston. There's its history. Came inland 18 hours later. This was the hurricane force wind probabilities on the first advisory.
Yeah.
Nobody
Hey, 85 mile an hour. I missed it, folks. We don't do good with these rapid genesis, rapid intensification, small circulation storms. We really don't have much good guidance on it.
Yeah, Opal was like that too. Luckily,
it was big. That was a scary. Luckily, it went back downhill.
Yeah.
Opal was the aborted. That was one of the ones that was an aborted evacuation. They woke up right before dawn and realized they had a almost Cat 5 southeast of New Orleans, racing towards Pensacola, and they had not evacuated. They started an evacuation, and then the tide started coming up. And Carter stuck in the road. They ordered everyone to go back home. And they got damn lucky in that it fell apart right before
that
they
would have
were
been a total disaster.
How about that? If someone tells you rapid intensification is rare, within proximity of land, this is just data. These are the ones that went 30 knots or greater to a Cat 3 or higher in the Gulf of Mexico. And, you know, at least historically, the area from, we don't die, from the Redneck Riviera back to the Central Texas coast is where most of these have done happen.
What did you say? The Redneck Riviera.
That's
another
not
name.
those of us
The Redneck Riviera, right?
My
that's
in-laws,
what we call it.
yeah, my in-laws were
And
there.
we're proud of it too.
Part of the Florida that should belong to Alabama.
Yeah.
One place you'll see a guy getting suntanned out there with a cowboy hat on and cowboy boots. And,
Right.
And
he doesn't need suntan lotion because he just uses the oil out of the
and a
sand.
rock bathing suit. That's horrible.
But accurate.
You and I were talking about these last night. A lot of these weaken right before landfall, but the energy's been imparted to the ocean. And one of the studies that's ongoing now is how to calculate and forecast if there's a way to do it, what the storm surge impact, because now you've got all this water moving, and just because the storm weakens 6 hours before landfall doesn't mean the storm surge is not going to be a problem. And Katrina is the
Right.
case study that we use for that right now. Some people try to use Ike, but that's not the case. It was strengthening right up to landfall. It didn't weaken. It didn't strengthen as much as we thought it would, but it wasn't a weakening storm. So there's kind of what you tell people. Economists, they have no humor in the economist world. My financial advisor kind of does. He admitted, he called 2008 as his Hurricane Katrina. It was a nightmare for him. Hurricane Ike. Why do you think I ended up briefing President Bush and a whole bunch of the cabinet and Dick Cheney at 7:30 in the morning after Ike made landfall? What do you think happened that day? Or what was getting ready to happen? The crash. They thought we would have a fuel situation on top of the... Because if that actually happens, that scenario in Galveston, when it happens, you will lose output from those plants from anywhere from 3 to 6 months. Because the chip channel's narrow, it'll be full, and the plants will have their own damage. So clearing that out is a 3 to 6 month problem. The estimate was gasoline would have been 10 to 15 bucks a gallon. All right, this is audience participation time. How many of you know the flood risk of the home you live in? Maybe 20%. I ask this to every audience, I'm not picking on you. You're about average, actually. So how many of you have flood insurance? Okay, those of you that don't know the flood risk of your house, why don't you have flood insurance?
Because I live in a very high area and it would take the biblical flood.
Then maybe you do know your flood risk. Most people don't because they're not required to. If you really think about it. How many of you have a mortgage? How many of you have a mortgage without fire insurance?
You can't have a mortgage without fire insurance.
Bingo. There's no law on that, by the way. The lenders will not lend you the money.
It's the banks say that's the law.
Yeah. Banks are not smart, as we all know after the crash. They're stupid, and I'll show you why. How many of you know what wind speed your building was built to withstand? That's amazing, because a lot of times there's none. I do, only because I have a new house, and the reason I bought it is the builder was advertising he built it to 2003 Coastal Windstorm Engineering Code, which was 120 mile an hour, which was 30 mile an hour higher than what you could get in Galveston County when I first moved there. So I said, man, this guy is actually, he's got it. We market it, people like me will buy it, and tell people this is why you should buy it. Hurricane Ike, we had 60 gusts to 80 for about 4 hours. It took my son 2 hours and a 6-pack to write the fence up in the backyard. Went back there 2 days later. I was all over the attic with a flash. It's a frame house and has shingles. Usually get damage on that. There's damage all over the place in the neighborhood, but I'll point out why this is important in a later slide. Maybe you have a family action plan. Okay. The day before I flew over to work Hurricane Katrina, just yank me when you think I'm going too far here, but remember the Turnaround, Don't Drown campaign? Allstate sponsored that, and James Lee Witt was one of the advocates. So we did a big rollout of it in Houston on billboards and all this stuff. Well, the CEO of Allstate had his top agents in for a breakfast meeting with James Lee Witt, and because I was part of the program as then MIC, I was on the speaker's table there, and I asked the same question. You know how many of the Allstate agents had a family action plan for their families? The CEO, he was looking at me. I mean, if his stare could have worked, I would have immediately gone bald with a flame. He was so pissed off. James Lee Witt was with Cheshire Cat grin, because he's one of those that gets it that we don't do this stuff, folks. How can we expect people to do the right thing if those of us that theoretically study this crap don't? That's why. Ain't gonna happen to me. The rare events. It's not just, I mean, this is for not just hurricanes, but I tailor most of this obviously to hurricanes. It's a rare event. Low probability occurrence, high probability of severe impact. And another book called The Black Swan, and no, it's not about ballet, it's about forecasting and statistics and economics. It's a difficult read. If you can work your way through it, it has some kernels of knowledge in there about why our whole science of statistics doesn't handle outliers correctly. And it's lost on my family. I'm the only scientist. Everyone else is a liberal arts guy, and they just go, oh, lay it bottom. So I try to come up with other ways to get to them on this, and that's kind of fun. But denial is a natural human response. I kind of learned that from both. The other book you ought to read is called The Unthinkable, Amanda Ripley. Available on Amazon for less than $15. You need to read that book if you're into this kind of stuff. It was really written about the 9/11, which is truly unthinkable. Someone flying an airplane into a building, but she actually had, the first chapter was denial. And she had a little bit about Katrina in there that was very interesting. And I followed up on that ever since to try to get through the fog on this stuff. So you're dealing with outliers, you're in denial by nature. For a big hurricane, at 48 hours, most folks don't believe it means them. Due to a number of things, one of which is usually it looks like what it looks like outside when the time comes. And they might not have looked at the TV, but I find that hard to believe, but it's the uncertainty. We don't know. We can't tell them with certainty where this thing's going to be, how strong, how big, and what the exact impact would be at their house. And when you put in probabilities, you fall them over. You lose them.
Yep.
Now, you're uneducated about the threat. No one's told you you're in a flood zone. Unless you're in the 100-year. Most states don't let people build in the 100-year anymore. And the stupid banks will lend you money if you're in the 110-year flood zone. You don't know your wind code, but if you move from Michigan to Louisiana, would you assume right away that your house would fall down in a hurricane? No. You'd assume that that you build for what the climate gives you down there. Not true. You build to what the builders are able to get away with, and they lobby back and forth with people that actually try to change to a more reasonable code. So you're reactive rather than proactive. And the massive evacuation from Rita is a classic example. The governor of Texas said, your house is built like shit and it'll fall down. So did the mayor of Houston. So people said, hey, the officials think we live in crap, we better get out of here. Look out the window, Martha and Ted are filling up their car with everything that'll go and heading down the street. So you look at each other and say, holy shit, we better go too. You get in your car and everybody's on the road at once. Not planned. No one planned it right. It was a disaster. And it'll happen again in places that haven't experienced it. The 100-year event does not mean if you had it this year, it won't happen for 100 years, folks. Try that all the time on people. The way to look at it with the lending people, and this is where I'm trying to work on fire, your risk of fire, the worst building code in the country for fire is 1 in 500. Yet you have to have fire insurance. Not so with flood. If we just jack flood to 500, you would eliminate a whole lot of the misunderstanding of your risk of flooding in the coastal zone. Ain't going to happen. You will not get the lawmakers we have now to pass any regulatory law. When are you going to happen? Maybe a few years from now, in a couple of disasters, who knows? But show the lenders this, maybe they'll take it on. They're forcing people to buy insurance for a 6% risk and a 30-year mortgage of getting whacked by fire, but not for a 20% risk for a 150-year event. If you get the lenders to say, I won't give you a loan unless you can prove you're outside the 500-year flood zone without flood insurance, maybe we'll start improving on the education of the flood risk. Tropical Storm Allison. 50,000 structures were flooded in there, and less than 10,000 of them were inside the 100-year flood zone. The rest were all in the 110 to 500-year flood zone. Houston's built on an old river delta from the Brazos River. In fact, one of the astronauts, who's a geographer from Rutgers, he renamed Houston as, from showing some satellite pictures, as Bangladesh with money. But none of these people who were flooded, since they weren't required to have flood insurance, had any idea that this was going to happen to them. It was they never had before, which you hear people say, well, before maybe 5 years. They lived there 5 years and they've been flooded. So what? That's, on Mother Nature's time scale, that's equivalent to farting in a feedlot. It has no impact whatsoever. Storm surge. We'll be back, but should we? That's the Bolivar Peninsula, swept clean. By the way, it's the 4th time since white man settled it that it's been swept clean. But you'll hear people say it never happened before. This was what we call the last house standing. Everything inside it was destroyed, but the structure itself was fine. It totally rebuilt its property. he had built it up 4 feet higher, and he had 4 feet higher stilts, so the waves went under it, but not the water. Spray came up in there from all the leaks. I know the guy that owns this place, or owned that place. A NOAA Corps officer that does tide gauges. I guess risk does not bother this guy, because he rebuilt. And you know how we always say they rebuild bigger and better the next time, and that's setting the table with better hurricane data from Mother Nature. Fort Fun ended up 10 miles inland in Chambers County. So here was his old elevation. He took it up to 20. 15 feet was the nominal tide elevation there with waves on it. That wasn't the biggest thing you can get. I kept telling him that, Alan, you can get worse than this. And he said, I know. I'm willing to take the risk. It's not my permanent home, it's my summer home. So I said, Alan, every time your community gets wiped out, it's not just your house. It's the roads, fire department, schools, police, medical care. Guess who pays for that?
Mm-hmm.
Mike in Wichita.
Right.
Mike in Wichita, do you like paying for Bolivar to rebuild 6 times in a century?
As long as you guys keep paying for Greensburg to be rebuilt, I suppose it's somewhat fair, except that the dollar amount for hurricanes is a lot higher than it is for tornadoes.
Exactly. And
Well, doesn't South Carolina, I think, and at least Wilmington, North Carolina, if your house gets washed away, it stays, and you can't rebuild, right? Is that
well,
right?
That's supposedly the rule in Texas. And
Yeah,
a
well,
lot of lawyers are getting rich right now fighting that.
Uh-huh.
Mother Nature's going to win. The Bolivar now has its
Right.
highest 0.4 feet. And it's about 100 feet narrower, and it's been getting narrower. Carla, there were 3 more blocks in the ocean when Carla hit just in 1961, so it's disappearing.
Oh, yeah.
It's an eroding beach. Anywhere from the mouth of the Mississippi down to the central Texas coast is eroding. South Padre, that area is an accreting beach. They're gaining what gets ripped away from them.
I would say from Cape Cod all the way around.
No, it's not that simple. There's some that lose, some that gain. That's just the nature.
Right.
You know what a barrier island really is?
What?
Sandbar, bingo, right name. Okay, wind and hurricanes. This is the trend in dollar damage, and it looks pretty dull. I mean, when you factor in a few things. So why is the trend going up? Well, we're building in the coastal zone, but here's another factor we don't talk about much is we decided we had to have big houses. The house I grew up in Wilmington was built in 1950. It was 1,300 square feet. For most of my life, I didn't understand why Dad didn't live in a bigger house. Because as I grew older, people had bigger houses. The average house in 1950 was 983 square feet, so he actually lived in a huge house compared to the average house. Hell, I know people with closets that big in these big mansions. And there were 3.37 people per house in the same statistic. This was actually in The Economist, and it was more about energy efficiency than it was hurricane damage threat, but I found it useful for that. I can't believe this, but this is, it's hard to argue with the statistics. The average house in 2010, using the same methodology, is 2,400 change. I never lived in a house that big, for crying out loud. But there's less people in it. So guess what's in it now?
Stuff.
Stuff!
Yeah. Correct. Big screen TV.
So a 900 square foot house gets not total damage, but damage from a hurricane. You have X amount of dollar damage. It's a lot more when it's a 2,400 square foot house. Institute for Building and Home Safety. Anyone heard of that group? Mm-hmm. My next lifetime, I want to come back because these guys designed to destroy. They built this facility in South Carolina. And it's the size of a big hangar. There's a wall with 110, 300 horsepower electric fans and a whole bunch of vanes and baffling devices so they can actually replicate real world wind situations and put real houses in there to test what happens. And I got the chance to go up there. This is a house built to the Illinois State Building Code. They call it gravity and nails, the engineers. And for 2% more, how many of you heard builders say it costs too much to wind engineer a house? Right. 2% more, there's 120 mile an hour code. This is after 60 gusts to 80 kind of winds, and there's a bunch of superficial looking damage on the outside that they estimate would have been 20 to 25 grand to repair. The water damage by the water driven in between all that and into the house is a factor of 2 to 4, depending on the place of the contents that are getting damaged. So is there any big surprise when a Category 1 Katrina crosses South Florida, it does over $1 billion damage? Or Ike, the third most costly storm with mostly winds. I mean, the areas that were flooded were confined pretty much to the immediate coastline. The wind damage was by far the largest amount in there. Well, they played with us after that, and they jacked it up to 100. And they blew that sucker right off the slab. Pulls the nails out. Nails loose. Gravity can't hold when the wind becomes too strong. And the cool thing was that the whole thing slid and went slamming out into the field behind there. Wouldn't it be a cool job?
Somewhat, unless you have to clean
How'd
it.
you like that house on the right there? The damage it had was from junk falling off the broken house. So when a builder tells you that it costs 15, 20% more and people want to buy it, don't buy his line of BS. It's not true. We need to turn the building industry into advocates where they market this stuff, because it also gets you, my new house is almost twice as energy efficient as a non-engineered house. It doesn't leak anywhere. It does, because it doesn't react to wind shears, your caulking doesn't break down as fast. Because it doesn't react to wind shear, the shingles hold up better. A lot of things happen that save you money for that 2% more. So the coastal development, and here are why I think people, we link to a 100-year event everywhere, and the risk is a lot higher than people imagine, and they're not told. There's no reason why they would know they're at risk. So it really does kind of crack me up watching these floods along the big rivers in the Midwest this year. People standing next to their houses, gigantic levee next to them is, I didn't think I was at risk. We don't require sellers to notify buyers of the integrity of the buildings they're buying with respect to wind. There's no requirement that I know of anywhere in the country that is forcing someone to do that. When a house is built, it has to be certified, but everything after that is fair game. Local leaders won't convey risk. In Biloxi, Mississippi, one of the city officials, employees, had this great idea of painting blue rings on the new steel telephone poles to indicate high water marks in Katrina. The Chamber of Commerce lobbied hard and had that thrown out. We don't want to scare people away from here. Biloxi's been wiped out 6 times. And I have had no success at winning over this group. I'm considered hostile, I think, at that point. But I don't think it'll stop people from moving there. But if you're intelligent about the risk, you plan for it better. It makes sense to me. So I think we have this underestimation of risk because of that. And is it really a surprise that we as meteorologists put out products that convey threat and risk as if people at the other end understand what it means to them and why they sometimes don't get it? And that's where I think a lot of our challenges are. It's not the meteorology, it's the social side of it. How do you get your culture to do the right thing? How am I going on time? Who's running the show? Is anyone running the show?
What time is it?
I can go nuts forever? When do you want me to shut up?
10 more minutes.
Oh, wow.
12:05 is the time.
Well, the next one's 12:10, so,
No,
All right.
but we're okay.
give him 10 minutes.
We'll go into lunch. 10 minutes.
I don't have much use for seasonal forecasts. And last year was my great. I finally had the 4-pack I needed to show why. Busy season, lots of impact. Busy season, no impact. Light season, no impact. Light season, all the hell broke loose. It has no use for the job I have in hand, which is saving lives and property. It has some use for someone that has widespread interest, like a Home Depot, offshore energy, shipping. The Navy doesn't use it. It serves no useful purpose for their planning for their fleet. They plan every year as if the fleet's going to get nailed by one, which is the right way to do it. So here's our seasonal forecast, and we're forecasting a busy season. If we hit the upper end of this, it'd be 2 back-to-back really busy seasons, which is not unheard of, but it would be often almost the outlier end. So, after my sermon, there's no wrong answer here. This is another one of these audience participation things. So this year, based on a forecast of a more active season, more impacts than perhaps than last year, plan for more impacts than last year? Okay, we'll take her. So my wife's response is, another one is go to any state or province that begins with the letter O. The same as every year. Me and Fugator on this page. If you plan every year for the worst case scenario, anything less than that happens, you're more than prepared for it. It can be, some people have to be detailed and have it right down to the gnat's eyebrow, everything you do, and others like me have to have very general things. we're in a high rise right in on Biscayne Bay. You know, you think, then you practice what you preach. No, I got a plan. We're on the 28th floor. 72 hours out, wife's plan is Bill is going to buy her a ticket on Southwest Airlines to Hobby Airport. And if it's heading there, skip Hobby and go to Albuquerque. That's our plan. And we got the stuff. I got 7 days. My goal was to always have 7 days worth of consumables in the house. That includes scotch and coffee.
The important thing.
Yeah. Today in the tropics, there's a wave out here that has sparked our interest a little yesterday, but it's looking a little hostile right now. It's over the islands, dry air, shear, the whole 9 yards. Big, massive high pressure causing the heat wave is pretty much shutting the door on stuff in the Gulf. We're getting close to the time of the year we start watching these waves as they march off of Africa. And this is right now where the highest heat anomaly is. It's the warmest. Most of the tropical Atlantic is a little above normal, but the peak above normal, and almost to 1.5 degrees, is ominously the main development region right here east of the island. So it would not surprise me if we really get the running shoes moving in August and September, given the conditions in the tropics. But right now it looks more July like it's supposed to in the last couple of weeks. East Pac, same thing. Pretty quiet going on across there. Convection that's over land is typical of what you can see. And then the dying embers of Dora, though it flared up a little, hasn't quite yet crossed into the colder water, but it's ingesting really stable air off that cold water into its west side. We're flying missions to try to better understand and maybe get a good forecast technique on the decay over cold water. This was one we were able to get a plane out there to do it. Number one concern, it continues to be Haiti. Probably have the number a little overdone. They say there's 675,000 now living in the 10 cities, but the ones that have left have moved back into the rubble of what were their homes because they gave up on waiting for more permanent structures. Normally you can use the phrase, run from the water, hide from the wind, and people survive. A Cat 3 or 4 going over tents is not something I would recommend anyone have to put up with, but we don't have a solution for that. There are not enough structures safe to put people in Haiti in the event of a major hurricane hitting there. And given their location and what seems like an incredible string of bad luck, I worry about those. That's it. Thank you very much.